Hey guys, tonight we're setting sail, not across gentle seas, but through the turbulent currents of history to the sun-drenched, war-torn landscapes of 17th century West Central Africa. Imagine a world teeming with powerful kingdoms, intricate political alliances, and the ever-expanding shadow of European colonial ambition. Tonight, we delve into the extraordinary life of Queen Nzinga Mbande, the brilliant and formidable ruler of the Ndongo and Matamba kingdoms in what is now Angola. She was a woman who, for decades, skillfully navigated the treacherous waters of diplomacy and warfare, defying Portuguese attempts to conquer her lands and enslave her people. If you were suddenly dropped into her royal court, with its complex protocols, shifting loyalties, and the constant threat of betrayal or invasion, you probably won't survive this intricate game of power and survival without Nzinga's level of cunning, courage, and sheer tenacity. This wasn't just ruling, this was high stakes, geopolitical chess where the pawns were human lives and the board was an entire kingdom. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And please, do let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. It's always incredible to see how these stories of resilience resonate across the globe. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself in the heart of West Central Africa in the early 1600s. The air is warm, thick with the scent of tropical vegetation, wood smoke, and the distant tang of the Atlantic Ocean. This is the land of the Mbundu people, a collection of powerful kingdoms and chieftaincies, rich in culture, tradition, and, unfortunately for them, resources that European powers are beginning to covet, particularly human beings for the burgeoning transatlantic slave trade. The Kingdom of Ndongo, where our story begins, is one of an important Mbundu states, located inland from the Portuguese coastal settlement of Luanda. It's a land of rolling savannas, dense forests, and winding rivers, a landscape that will become the stage for decades of conflict and diplomacy. The Portuguese had established a presence on the Angolan coast in the late 16th century, initially interested in trade, copper, ivory, and, increasingly, slaves. Luanda, founded in 1576, became their primary foothold, a base from which they sought to expand their influence and control inland, driven by the insatiable demand for enslaved labor in their Brazilian sugar plantations. This encroachment created a volatile and dangerous environment for the indigenous kingdoms. Alliances shifted like sand, betrayals were commonplace, and warfare was a constant, brutal reality. The Portuguese weren't just friendly traders dropping by for a cup of palm wine. They were an aggressive colonial power, armed with muskets and a ruthless determination to extract wealth from the land, primarily through the horrific trafficking of its people. Into this crucible of conflict, Nzinga Mbande was born, likely around 1583. She was a princess of Ndongo, daughter of King Kiluanji Samba. Her world from her earliest days would have been steeped in the traditions of Mbundu royalty, but also overshadowed by the ever-growing threat from the coast. She would have witnessed firsthand the devastating impact of Portuguese slave raiding, the political instability it fueled among the Mbundu states, and the desperate measures her people took to resist or accommodate this powerful new foreign presence. It's like growing up in a beautiful, ancient house while a relentless demolition crew is slowly, but surely starting to tear down the neighborhood, and you know your home is next on their list. The society Nzinga was born into was complex and hierarchical, with established systems of governance, trade, and religious belief. The title for the ruler of Ndongo was Ngola, which is actually the origin of the name Angola. While leadership roles were often held by men, Mbundu society, like many in West Central Africa, had traditions where women could wield significant political power, acting as regents, queen mothers, or even rulers in their own right in certain circumstances. This context is crucial for understanding Nzinga's later rise. She wasn't an anomaly plucked from obscurity. She was a product of a system that while patriarchal in many respects, did allow for female agency and authority in ways that might surprise those accustomed only to European models of the time. A key historical fact is that the Portuguese presence was not just military, it was also religious. Catholic missionaries, often accompanying the soldiers and traders, sought to convert the local populations. This added another layer of complexity to the interactions between the Mbundu kingdoms and the Europeans, with conversion sometimes being used as a tool of diplomacy or a means of seeking favor or alliance. Nzinga herself would later navigate these religious waters with characteristic astuteness. A quirky, though perhaps grim, tidbit from this era is the Portuguese use of presidios, fortified outposts, as they pushed inland. These were not just defensive structures but also centers for trade, including slave trading and springboards for further military expeditions. For the Mbundu people, the sight of a new presidio being constructed nearby would have been an ominous sign, a clear indication of Portugal's encroaching ambitions. Historians still argue about the precise nature of political power and succession within Ndongo and neighboring Mbundu states. Before and during Nzinga's time, were titles and authority passed down in a strictly patrilineal or matrilineal fashion? Or was it a more fluid system, influenced by personal charisma, military prowess, and strategic alliances? Understanding these internal dynamics is key to appreciating the challenges and opportunities Nzinga faced as she moved from princess to player on this complex geopolitical stage. The Angolan crucible was hot, dangerous, and unforgiving, but it was also the very environment that forged one of Africa's most remarkable and resilient leaders. You're now peering into the early years of Nzinga Mbande, a princess born into the heart of the Ndongo kingdom, a realm under increasing pressure. Her childhood and adolescence, unfolding in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, wouldn't have been a sheltered idyll of royal ease. Instead, it was a rigorous, often perilous apprenticeship in the complex arts of Mbundu politics, diplomacy, and warfare, all set against the backdrop of her father's, King Kiluwanji Kia Samba's struggle to maintain Ndongo's independence against the encroaching Portuguese. This was no fairy tale princess waiting for a prince. This was a future queen being forged in the fires of resistance. Nzinga was not her father's only child, nor was her path to ultimate power a straightforward one. She had siblings, including a brother, Ngola Mbande, who would later inherit the kingship directly from their father, and other sisters, like Kifunji and Mukambu, who would also play roles, sometimes supportive, sometimes tragically oppositional, in her long and tumultuous life. Royal succession among the Mbundu was not always a simple case of primogeniture. While her brother was the heir apparent, Nzinga, by all accounts, was a keen observer and an active participant in the life of the court from a young age. She was reportedly her father's favorite child, a detail that might have afforded her opportunities for education and involvement in state affairs that were not available to all royal women. You can imagine her as a young girl, not just playing with traditional Mbundu games or learning domestic skills, but also listening intently to the discussions of elders, the reports of warriors, and the negotiations with envoys from neighboring states or even the Portuguese. Her playground was, in a sense, the political arena itself. A key aspect of Nzinga's early life was her exposure to warfare. King Kiluwanji was frequently engaged in conflicts, either defending Ndongo's borders against rival Mbundu groups, who were themselves often manipulated or armed by the Portuguese, or directly resisting Portuguese military expeditions aimed at capturing slaves and asserting dominance. It's said that Nzinga often accompanied her father on these military campaigns, not as a passive observer, but as an active participant, learning strategy, tactics, and perhaps even how to wield weapons. This early military training would prove invaluable in her later career as a warrior queen. It's like an internship, but instead of fetching coffee, you're learning how to command troops and survive ambushes. Right, princess. Her father might have said, "Today's lesson how to properly deploy skirmishers against a Portuguese musket line? And try not to get captured. The paperwork is a nightmare." Her education wouldn't have been formal in the European sense of tutors and textbooks, though the Mbundu had rich oral traditions and their own systems of knowledge transmission. Instead, it would have been a practical education in statecraft, learning the intricacies of Mbundu customary law. The art of rhetoric and public speaking crucial for a leader who needed to command loyalty and persuade councils. The delicate dance of diplomacy with both African neighbors and the duplicitous Europeans. And the economic underpinnings of the kingdom, which, tragically, was becoming increasingly entangled with the slave trade. She would have learned about the traditional religious beliefs of her people, the importance of ancestor veneration, and the rituals that sustain the spiritual well-being of the kingdom. A historical fact that highlights the brutal reality of her formative years is the intensity of the Portuguese Angolan Wars during this period. These weren't minor skirmishes, they were sustained military campaigns designed to break the resistance of the Mandu kingdoms and secure a steady supply of captives for the slave trade. The Portuguese employed not only their own soldiers, armed with muskets and cannons, but also increasingly relied on auxiliary troops recruited from rival African groups or from enslaved Africans themselves. A classic divide-and-conquer strategy. Nzinga would have seen the devastation firsthand: villages burned, crops destroyed, people carried off in chains. This searing experience undoubtedly fueled her later determination to resist. A quirky and rather revealing tidbit often recounted about Nzinga's youth is that her name itself, Nzinga or Jinga. Nginga is said to derive from the Kimbundu verb kujinga, meaning to twist or turn. This was supposedly because she was born with her umbilical cord wrapped around her neck, an omen that, according to some traditions, signified a difficult birth, but also a strong, perhaps even troublesome or headstrong, personality. Whether this etymology is entirely accurate or a later embellishment, it certainly fits the tenacious, adaptable, and often convention-twisting character she would become. Historians still debate the precise nature of Nzinga's relationship with her brother, Ngola Mbande, during these early years and leading up to his reign. Some accounts suggest a degree of rivalry or mistrust, perhaps fueled by their father's favoritism towards Nzinga or by her own evident intelligence and ambition, which might have been seen as a threat in a system where female leadership, while possible, was not the norm for the paramount ruler. Was she already, in her youth, subtly maneuvering and building alliances, preparing for a future where she might have to fight for her place and her people's survival? It's a tantalizing question. What is clear is that Nzinga was not raised to be a retiring wallflower. She was immersed in a world of high-stakes politics, constant warfare, and the ever-present threat of foreign domination. Her early life was a crucible, forging a princess into a pragmatist, a diplomat, and a warrior, equipping her with the skills, the resilience, and the burning desire for sovereignty that would define her legendary reign. The lessons learned at her father's side, in the royal court and on the battlefield, were harsh but essential preparation for the decades of struggle that lay ahead. The years pass, marked by the relentless rhythm of Portuguese encroachment and Mbundu resistance. Nzinga's father, King Kiluwanji, dies, and her brother, Ngola Mbande, ascends to the throne of Ndongo, sometime around 1617. His reign is immediately beset by intensified Portuguese aggression. The new governor of the Portuguese colony of Angola, João Correia de Sousa, is particularly ruthless, launching devastating military campaigns deep into Ndongo territory, capturing thousands for enslavement, and seeking to impose Portuguese suzerainty. Ndongo is teetering on the brink of collapse. It is in this dire context, with her brother's kingdom crumbling, that Nzinga steps onto the grand stage of international diplomacy in a truly unforgettable way. You are about to witness her legendary 1622 embassy to Luanda, a masterclass in political theater and shrewd negotiation. King Ngola Mbande, facing overwhelming military pressure and the potential annihilation of his kingdom, decides to sue for peace. And who does he choose to lead this critical, perhaps last-ditch, diplomatic mission to the Portuguese capital of Luanda? Not one of his male advisors or military commanders, but his astute and formidable sister, Nzinga. This choice itself speaks volumes about her recognized abilities, her intelligence, and perhaps her brother's desperation. He needed someone who could hold their own against the arrogant Portuguese, someone with presence, intellect, and unwavering resolve. He needed Nzinga. It was a bit like sending your sharpest, most unshakable lawyer into a high-stakes negotiation, where the other side holds all the obvious cards, and your lawyer doesn't even flinch. Imagine Nzinga's journey from the Ndongo heartland to the coastal city of Luanda. It would have been a perilous trek through territory ravaged by war, a constant reminder of what was at stake. When she and her entourage finally arrive in Luanda, a city increasingly dominated by Portuguese architecture, soldiers, and merchants, the atmosphere is thick with tension and colonial disdain. Governor Correa de Sousa, expecting a supplicant from a defeated kingdom, prepares to receive her with a calculated display of Portuguese power and superiority. The most famous and indeed iconic moment of this encounter occurs when Nzinga enters the governor's audience chamber. A key historical fact, recounted in numerous sources, is that the governor, João Correa de Sousa, had arranged the room so that he was seated on an imposing chair, a symbol of his authority, while only a floor mat or cushion was provided for Nzinga. This was a deliberate slight, a nonverbal communication designed to humble her, to remind her of her supposedly inferior status as a representative of a barbarian African kingdom, seeking terms from the mighty Portuguese. It was a classic colonial power play. Many an envoy might have been intimidated, flustered, or forced to accept this humiliating arrangement. But Nzinga is no ordinary envoy. She assesses the situation in an instant, without missing a beat, without a word of protest that might be construed as weakness. She signals to one of her female attendants. This attendant immediately drops to her hands and knees, offering her own back as a seat for Nzinga. Nzinga then calmly and regally sits upon her attendant, placing herself at eye level with the Portuguese governor. Boom. Mic drop. 17th century Angolan style. With this single, swift, and incredibly powerful gesture, Nzinga completely subverts the governor's intended display of dominance. She demonstrates her own authority, her resourcefulness, and her absolute refusal to be demeaned. She makes it clear that she is his equal, an envoy of a sovereign power, not a petitioner to be patronized. The governor, and indeed all the Portuguese officials present, must have been utterly stunned. Their carefully constructed power dynamic shattered before a word of negotiation had even been spoken. You can almost hear the collective Portuguese gasp. Did she just use her lady-in-waiting as a chair? This isn't going to be as easy as we thought. This act, though seemingly small, set the tone for the entire negotiation. Nzinga proceeded to conduct herself with extraordinary skill, dignity, and intelligence. She spoke eloquently, fluently in Portuguese, which she had likely learned or refined through interactions with traders or missionaries, and argued forcefully for the rights of Ndongo. She demanded the withdrawal of Portuguese troops from Ndongo territory, the return of captured subjects, and the cessation of hostilities. She also, very cannily, offered concessions, including a willingness to discuss an alliance and even, potentially, her own conversion to Christianity. A quirky, though perhaps apocryphal detail sometimes added to the story is that after the long negotiations were concluded, and as Nzinga prepared to leave, Governor de Sousa, perhaps trying to regain some semblance of his authority or genuinely impressed, supposedly remarked that the human chair could now get up. Nzinga is said to have replied coolly that she had no further use for it, as she did not intend to sit on it again, implying that she would not be returning to Luanda under such demeaning circumstances, or that her attendant was not a mere piece of furniture to be dismissed. It's a zinger that perfectly encapsulates her regal pride and sharp wit. Historians still debate the precise nuances of these negotiations and the immediate outcomes. Was Nzinga's human chair gambit a pre-planned power move, or a brilliant improvisation? How much of her initial success was due to her undeniable charisma and intellect, versus the Portuguese perhaps being temporarily willing to ease pressure on Ndongo for their own strategic reasons? What is undeniable is that Nzinga's embassy to Luanda in 1622 was a stunning diplomatic debut. She transformed a situation designed to humiliate her into a demonstration of her power and an assertion of her kingdom's sovereignty. She returned to Ndongo having secured a temporary peace treaty, a promise of Portuguese withdrawal from some areas, and having left an indelible impression on her adversaries. The princess had proven herself a queen in all but name, a master of the diplomatic chessboard. Nzinga returns from her remarkable diplomatic chess match in Luanda, having wrested a temporary peace from the Portuguese. She has stared down Governor João Correia de Sousa, metaphorically and literally from the back of her human chair, and has demonstrated that Ndongo, while battered, is not yet broken. But one of the most significant and arguably most complex outcomes of this 1622 embassy was Nzinga's own decision to be baptized into the Christian faith, taking the name Dona Ana de Sousa, with the governor himself acting as her godfather. This wasn't a sudden, emotional conversion like everything Nzinga did. It appears to have been a deeply calculated political and diplomatic move, a strategic gambit in the ongoing struggle for her kingdom's survival. You have to understand the context. For the Portuguese, the conversion of African rulers to Christianity was a key objective, intertwined with their colonial ambitions. It was seen as a way to civilize the local populations from their Eurocentric perspective, to create more pliable allies, and to legitimize their presence and their claims to territory. A Christian African ruler was, in theory, more likely to be a friend to Christian Portugal, more integrated into their sphere of influence, and perhaps more willing to facilitate trade, including the slave trade, on terms favorable to the Portuguese. So, when Nzinga, a high-ranking princess and a key negotiator for Ndongo, expressed a willingness to convert, it was a significant development, one that the Portuguese would have viewed with considerable satisfaction. It was a public relations coup for them, at the very least. They could proclaim, "Even the fierce Mbundu royalty are seeing the light of our Lord, and our superior way of life." But what was in it for Nzinga and Ndongo? From her perspective, baptism was a powerful diplomatic tool. By becoming Dona Ana de Sousa, she was, in a sense, forging a personal link with the Portuguese governor, her new godfather. This could create a channel for communication, a basis for more favorable treatment, and perhaps even a degree of protection. It signaled a willingness to engage with the Portuguese on their own terms, to play their game, at least superficially. It was a way of saying, "We can be allies. We can be part of your Christian world, if you will respect our sovereignty and cease your aggressions." It was a shield, potentially, against further Portuguese military campaigns. She might have reasoned that it's harder for a Christian governor to justify slaughtering his own Christian goddaughter's people, though, as history would show, religious affiliation was rarely a foolproof deterrent to colonial violence when resources and power were at stake. Furthermore, Nzinga was acutely aware of the internal politics of the Portuguese colonial enterprise. There were often different factions within the Portuguese administration, some favoring aggressive military conquest, others preferring more stable trade relationships. By converting, Nzinga might have hoped to appeal to those elements within the Portuguese system who favored diplomacy and alliance over constant warfare. She was, in essence, trying to build bridges, however fragile, with potential sympathizers or more moderate voices among her adversaries. A key historical fact is that missionary orders, like the Jesuits, were often influential in colonial politics, and a high-profile convert like Nzinga could gain their support, which might, in turn, influence the actions of the civil and military authorities. She wasn't just getting baptized, she was acquiring potential lobbyists within the enemy camp. The sincerity of Nzinga's conversion at this early stage is a matter of much scholarly debate. Was it a genuine spiritual awakening, a pragmatic political maneuver, or perhaps a complex mixture of both? Given her later actions, including her eventual alliance with the Mbangala, who had their own distinct, non-Christian religious practices, and her long periods of armed resistance against the Portuguese. Many historians lean towards the view that her 1622 baptism was primarily a strategic decision. She was using the tools available to her, and in a world where religious affiliation was so deeply intertwined with political identity and international relations, Christianity was a powerful card to play. She was essentially saying, if this is the language of power you understand, then I will speak it, but I will speak it for my own ends. Oh, one might humorously imagine her thinking, okay, I'll wear the cross, I'll learn the prayers, but don't expect me to stop sharpening my spears or training my warriors just because we're suddenly family in Christ. Governor! A quirky and telling aspect of her baptism was her choice of name, Ana de Sousa. Ana was a common Christian name, but de Sousa was the surname of her godfather, the governor himself. This was a deliberate act of creating a symbolic kinship, a public affirmation of this new, albeit politically charged, relationship. It was a clever piece of personal branding, designed to maximize the diplomatic leverage of her conversion. However, any hopes Nzinga might have had that her baptism and the peace treaty would usher in a lasting era of stability were soon to be dashed. The Portuguese appetite for slaves and territory was insatiable, and governors and their policies could change. The ink on the treaty was barely dry before new provocations and aggressions began. But Nzinga's calculated conversion had served its immediate purpose. It had bought Ndongo some breathing room. It had enhanced her own status and visibility as a key political player. And it had demonstrated her remarkable ability to adapt, to strategize, and to use any and all means at her disposal in the relentless defense of her people and her land. The baptismal font in Luanda was just another stop on her long, complex journey as a leader, a moment where faith and statecraft became inextricably and cunningly intertwined. Nzinga has played her diplomatic hand in Luanda, returning to Ndongo with a peace treaty and a new Christian name, Dona Ana de Sousa. But the fragile peace she so skillfully negotiated begins to fray almost immediately under the relentless pressure of Portuguese colonial ambitions and the internal fragilities of the Ndongo kingdom itself. Her brother, King Ngola Mbande, despite Nzinga's efforts, proves to be an ineffectual ruler, unable to either fully appease the Portuguese or effectively rally his own people to resist their constant incursions and slave raiding. The kingdom is in turmoil, and you can sense that another, more decisive shift in power is imminent. The reign of Ngola Mbande, from roughly 1617 to 1624, was characterized by weakness, vacillation, and, ultimately, tragedy. He struggled to maintain control over his subordinate chief Sobas, some of whom were increasingly collaborating with the Portuguese in exchange for trade goods like firearms or promises of power. The Portuguese, for their part, continued their aggressive policies, frequently violating the terms of the treaty Nzinga had negotiated, launching raids into Ndongo territory, and demanding ever-increasing tribute, often in the form of enslaved people. The king, it seems, was caught in an impossible bind, unable to satisfy either his own people's desire for security or the insatiable demands of the colonial power. He was, to put it mildly, not quite up to the task of navigating these incredibly treacherous waters. It's like trying to captain a ship in a hurricane with a leaky hull and a mutinous crew, while pirates are actively trying to board you? Good luck with that. It is within this context of escalating crisis and her brother's failing leadership that Nzinga's own influence and ambition likely grew. She had proven her capabilities in Luanda. She possessed the intelligence, the charisma, and the military experience that her brother seemed to lack. As the situation in Ndongo deteriorated, it's probable that many among the Mbundu nobility and warrior class began to look to her as a more viable leader, a stronger bulwark against Portuguese aggression. Then, around 1624, King Ngola Mbande dies. The circumstances surrounding his death are shrouded in mystery and controversy, forming a pivotal and often debated chapter in Nzinga's story. The most common narrative, though one promoted heavily by Nzinga's detractors and Portuguese sources keen to delegitimize her, is that Nzinga herself had her brother poisoned or otherwise arranged his assassination to clear her own path to the throne. Some versions of this story even claim she had his young son, her nephew, and a potential rival claimant murdered as well. These are dark accusations, painting a picture of ruthless, Machiavellian ambition. If true, it would mean Nzinga was willing to commit kinslaying, a grievous offense, to seize power. Oops, did little brother trip and fall into that conveniently placed vat of fast-acting royal succession aid? Tragic, and really... Anyway, about my coronation. A rather chilling, if entirely speculative, internal monologue. However, it's crucial to approach these accusations with caution. Much of what we know about Nzinga comes from European sources, particularly Portuguese, who often had a vested interest in portraying her as a cruel, illegitimate, and barbaric ruler, thereby justifying their own aggressive actions against her. Nzinga, for her part, consistently maintained that her brother, despondent over his inability to protect his kingdom, and perhaps fearing for his own life at the hands of either the Portuguese or disaffected elements within Ndongo, took his own life. She claimed she then stepped in to fill the power vacuum and prevent the complete collapse of the kingdom, acting as regent for her brother's young son, if he was indeed still alive at that point, or if she allowed him to live for a time. A key historical fact is that female leadership, while not the absolute norm for the Ngola title in Ndongo, was not without precedent in Mbundu societies or neighboring states. Women could, and did, wield significant political and even military power. Nzinga's claim to rule, therefore, while perhaps unconventional or contested by some factions, was not entirely outside the realm of possibility within her cultural context. She wasn't just a random sister deciding to take over. She was a recognized royal figure with proven abilities. Regardless of the precise means of her brother's demise, whether by his own hand, Nzinga's machinations, or other internal court intrigues, the outcome was that Nzinga Mbande, now in her early 40s, a seasoned diplomat and experienced military observer, found herself in a position to claim leadership of the Ndongo kingdom. She did so with characteristic decisiveness, outmaneuvering or eliminating rival claimants which might have included other relatives or powerful sobas, and rallying support among those who saw her as Ndongo's best hope against the Portuguese. Historians still engage in vigorous debate about Nzinga's role in her brother's death and her initial consolidation of power. Was she a ruthless usurper who seized the throne through bloodshed and betrayal? Or was she a pragmatic leader who stepped into a desperate situation, making hard choices to save her people from annihilation, using methods that were perhaps harsh but deemed necessary in a brutal political environment? The truth is likely complex, a mixture of ambition, necessity, and the brutal realities of 17th century African statecraft under colonial pressure. A quirky, though perhaps not entirely fair, way to think about it is that the political maneuvering in some of these royal courts could make a season of Game of Thrones look like a pleasantly uneventful tea party. What is undeniable is that by around 1624 to 1626, Nzinga Mbande had effectively become the Ngola, the ruler of Ndongo. She had navigated the treacherous currents of court politics, survived or neutralized her rivals, and now stood ready to confront the full might of the Portuguese colonial machine. The throne she had gained was far from secure. Her kingdom was ravaged by war and internal division, but Nzinga was not one to shrink from a challenge. The princess forged in fire had now become queen, and her decades-long struggle for sovereignty was about to begin in earnest. Nzinga now sits upon the throne of Ndongo, not as a regent or a temporary placeholder, but as its proclaimed Ngola, its queen. The year is roughly 1624, and the challenges facing her are monumental. Her kingdom is deeply fractured, its resources depleted by years of warfare and slave raiding. The Portuguese, initially perhaps surprised or even dismissive of a female ruler, soon realize that Nzinga is no pliant puppet. She is a formidable adversary. deeply committed to restoring Ndongo's strength and resisting their relentless colonial expansion. Her early reign as Queen of Ndongo is marked by a desperate, courageous, and often brutal struggle to hold her ground. A period of her first sustained military resistance against a technologically superior and insatiably greedy foe. One of Nzinga's immediate tasks was to consolidate her own authority within Ndongo. Her claim to the Ngolaship, especially as a woman succeeding her brother under controversial circumstances, was not universally accepted by all the Mbundu Sobus chiefs or by rival factions within the royal lineage. Some may have seen her as an illegitimate usurper, while others, perhaps more pragmatically, might have doubted her ability to effectively lead the kingdom against the Portuguese. Nzinga had to use a combination of diplomacy, patronage, and, where necessary, force to bring these dissenting elements into line or eliminate them as threats. She understood that a unified front was essential if Ndongo was to have any chance of survival. It's like trying to organize a very important group project where half the team thinks you shouldn't be the leader, and the other half is actively trying to sabotage the presentation. You need some serious management skills. Simultaneously, she had to confront the Portuguese. Any hopes that her Christian baptism as Dona Ana de Sousa, or the peace treaty she had negotiated, would ensure lasting Portuguese respect for Ndongo's sovereignty quickly evaporated. The Portuguese governors in Luanda, driven by the demands of the slave trade and the ambitions of settlers and merchants, continued to see Ndongo as ripe for conquest and exploitation. They launched fresh military campaigns, aiming to depose Nzinga, whom they often refused to recognize as the legitimate Angola, preferring to back more compliant puppet rulers and to capture more territory and, crucially, more slaves. Nzinga responded with a fierce and determined military resistance. Drawing on the military knowledge she had gained, accompanying her father on campaigns, and her own innate strategic intelligence, she rallied her warriors and engaged the Portuguese and their African allies in a series of grueling battles and skirmishes. She understood that she could not always match the Portuguese in open field battles, where their muskets and cannons often gave them a significant advantage over her forces, who were primarily armed with bows, arrows, spears, and battle axes. Therefore, she increasingly began to employ tactics that played to her strengths and exploited the weaknesses of her enemy guerrilla warfare, ambushes, raids on Portuguese supply lines, and strategic retreats into difficult terrain where European troops struggled. She was essentially writing the early chapters of a long and bloody instruction manual on how to fight an anti-colonial insurgency. They have guns. We have the terrain and the will. Let's make them wish they'd never heard of Ndongo. Might have been her strategic thinking. A key historical fact from this period is Nzinga's attempt to forge alliances with other Mbundu states, and even with some of the Portuguese's own disgruntled African allies. She understood that Ndongo could not stand alone indefinitely. She sent emissaries, made promises, and used her diplomatic skills to try and build a wider coalition against the common enemy. This was a difficult task, as many of these groups had their own rivalries and interests, and the Portuguese were masters at playing them off against each other. Despite her valiant efforts, the sheer military pressure from the Portuguese, combined with internal divisions and the devastating impact of the ongoing slave trade, which depopulated entire regions and sowed chaos, proved to be immense. Nzinga's forces suffered heavy losses. The Portuguese managed to install a rival Angola, Hari Akiluanje, on a sort of puppet throne, further confusing the political landscape and undermining Nzinga's legitimacy in the eyes of some. The situation was becoming increasingly desperate. One quirky, though tragic aspect of this warfare was the role of the Pombeiros, Afro-Portuguese traders who often acted as intermediaries in the slave trade, sometimes leading their own armed bands into the interior to capture slaves. These individuals, operating in the murky borderlands between cultures, were a constant source of friction and violence, often exacerbating conflicts for their own profit. Historians still debate the precise effectiveness of Nzinga's early military strategies during her initial reign in Ndongo. Was she able to inflict significant enough losses on the Portuguese to genuinely check their advance? Or was she primarily fighting a desperate, albeit heroic, delaying action? What is clear is that she refused to capitulate. Even as her territory shrank and her resources dwindled, her spirit of resistance remained unbroken. She was learning, adapting, and constantly seeking new ways to counter the Portuguese threat. Ultimately, however, the pressure became too great. By around 1626 or 1627, after several years of relentless warfare, Nzinga was forced to abandon her capital in Dongo and retreat eastward with her loyal followers. This was a bitter blow, a seeming defeat. But for Nzinga, it was not the end. It was merely a strategic withdrawal, a regrouping. She was exiled from her ancestral kingdom, but she was unbowed. The queen had lost a major battle, but the war for her people's freedom and her own sovereignty was far from over. She was about to demonstrate that her resilience was as formidable as her courage, and that a new chapter in her extraordinary story was about to unfold in the lands beyond Dongo. The heart of Ndongo, her ancestral kingdom, is now largely under the sway of a Portuguese-backed puppet ruler. Queen Nzinga, defeated in open battle but not in spirit, has been forced into a strategic retreat, leading her loyal warriors, her court, and many of her people eastward, away from the main centers of Portuguese power. You find yourself with her, perhaps in the late 1620s, a queen in exile, but an exile filled with a burning determination not just to survive, but to rebuild, to reassert her authority, and to continue the fight. This period of her life is a testament to her extraordinary resilience and her ability to forge new power from the ashes of apparent defeat. Her initial place of refuge was an island in the Kwanza River, a defensible position from which she could continue to harass the Portuguese and their allies, and attempt to rally support. But Nzinga knew that a small island stronghold was not a sustainable base for the kind of long-term resistance she envisioned. She needed a new kingdom, a new center of operations from which she could challenge both the Portuguese and the rival Mbundu leaders who had allied with them or usurped her authority in Dongo. Her gaze turned towards the kingdom of Matamba, located to the east of Ndongo, a region known for its fierce warriors and its relative remoteness from direct Portuguese control. It was a bit like a CEO whose company has been hostilely taken over, deciding to immediately start a new, even more ambitious venture next door, fueled by sheer grit and a refusal to admit defeat. Ndongo may be compromised, she might have thought. But Nzinga is not Matamba. Get ready for your new management. Matamba was a kingdom with its own distinct history and traditions. It had a reputation for martial prowess and had, at times, been ruled by queens. This existing tradition of female leadership may have made it a more receptive environment for Nzinga to assert her authority, especially as she arrived not as a supplicant, but as a renowned warrior and a legitimate royal figure from the prestigious Ndongo lineage. A key historical fact is that Nzinga, through a combination of diplomacy, strategic alliances, and, where necessary, military conquest, successfully established herself as the ruler of Matamba by the early 1630s. This was a remarkable achievement for an exiled queen. She didn't just find a hiding place, she carved out an entirely new domain for herself. Consolidating her power in Matamba was no easy task. She had to integrate her Ndongo followers with the existing Matamba population, overcome any local resistance to her rule, and establish a stable administration. She also had to defend Matamba's borders against its own set of local rivals and, increasingly, against Portuguese attempts to extend their influence further eastward. But Nzinga was in her element. She used her political acumen to forge alliances with local sobas, her military skills to defeat opponents, and her undeniable charisma to inspire loyalty among her new subjects. Matamba, under Nzinga's rule, began to transform from a relatively loosely organized kingdom into a more centralized and formidable military power. One of the most crucial and controversial aspects of Nzinga's strategy during this period was her alliance with the Mbangala or Jaga warrior bands. The Mbangala were highly militarized, nomadic groups with a fearsome reputation, known for their brutal initiation rites. their rejection of traditional agricultural life, and their effectiveness as soldiers. They operated outside the established Mbundu political structures and were often employed as mercenaries by various factions, including, at times, the Portuguese themselves. Nzinga, in a characteristically pragmatic and audacious move, allied herself with one of these Imbangala groups, led by a warrior chief named Kasanje. She even, according to some accounts, underwent their initiation rites and adopted some of their customs, including, allegedly, ritual cannibalism and infanticide. Though these claims are heavily debated by historians and may be exaggerated European propaganda designed to demonize her, this alliance, however morally ambiguous it might seem, provided Nzinga with a powerful, battle-hardened military force that significantly enhanced her ability to wage war. It was like hiring the most notorious biker gang in the region to be your personal security detail. Risky, but undeniably effective if you needed some serious muscle. A quirky tidbit often associated with Nzinga during her time building power in Matamba, and particularly in relation to the Imbangala, is the story that she began to dress as a man, maintained a harem of male wives or consorts whom she dressed as women, and insisted on being referred to as king rather than queen to underscore her supreme authority and martial prowess. While the details are debated and likely embellished, these stories point to her deliberate manipulation of gender roles and symbols of power to command respect and loyalty in a predominantly male warrior culture. Historians still argue about the nature and extent of Nzinga's adoption of Imbangala practices. Was it a full cultural immersion, a cynical political ploy to secure military support, or something in between? Did she genuinely embrace their warrior ethos, or was she merely using them as a means to an end? Regardless of her personal beliefs, the Mbangala alliance was a strategic masterstroke. It gave her the military clout she needed to not only secure her position in Matamba, but also to launch renewed offensives against the Portuguese and their allies in Ndongo. This period of exile and resilience, culminating in her establishment as the undisputed ruler of a strengthened Matamba, showcases Nzinga at her most adaptable and resourceful. She had turned a devastating setback into a new opportunity. She had lost a kingdom, only to forge another, arguably even stronger. 1. Matamba became her fortress, her recruiting ground, and the launching pad for the next phase of her decades-long struggle against colonial domination. The queen was down, but she was most definitely not out. She was merely reloading. Having successfully carved out a new kingdom for herself in Matamba, Queen Nzinga doesn't just sit back and enjoy her hard-won, if somewhat precarious, security. Oh no, that simply wouldn't be Nzinga's style. She sets about transforming Matamba from a collection of disparate groups and territories into a centralized, militarized state. A veritable fortress kingdom, capable of projecting power and sustaining a long-term war effort. You're witnessing the meticulous construction of a resistance movement, with Nzinga as its chief architect, CEO, and commander-in-chief. This isn't just about survival anymore, it's about building a regional powerhouse. Consolidating her rule in Matamba, as we touched upon, required Nzinga to be both a shrewd diplomat and a decisive military leader. She had to win over or subdue the existing Matamba chiefs and integrate her own Ndongo followers who had accompanied her into exile with the local population. This likely involved a delicate balance of patronage. Strategic marriages, though perhaps not her own at this stage. Gift-giving, and, when persuasion failed, a clear demonstration of military superiority, often with the help of her formidable Mbangala allies. She was essentially nation-building on the fly, in a hostile environment, while simultaneously fighting off external threats. No pressure, right? It's like trying to assemble complex IKEA furniture during an earthquake while also fending off angry badgers. A key aspect of Nzinga's state building in Matamba was the centralization of power in her own hands. She sought to break the influence of overly powerful local sobas and create a more direct line of command. She established a royal court, developed administrative structures, and ensured that military leadership was loyal to her. She understood that a fragmented kingdom was a vulnerable kingdom, Her experiences in Dongo, where internal divisions had been exploited by the Portuguese, had taught her this bitter lesson well. Crucially, Nzinga focused on building up Matamba's military strength. She didn't just rely on her Imbangala allies, she actively recruited and trained her own Matamba warriors, incorporating elements of Imbangala military discipline and tactics, while also drawing on traditional Mbundu martial traditions. Her army became a formidable force, known for its mobility, its resilience, and its ability to operate effectively in the local terrain. A historical fact is that Matamba, under Nzinga, became a major military power in the region, capable of challenging not only the Portuguese but also other neighboring African states. She wasn't just defending, she was creating an offensive capability. She effectively turned Matamba into a militarized buffer state, or perhaps more accurately, a resistance state. Nzinga also understood the importance of economic strength to sustain her war effort. Matamba was strategically located to control certain trade routes into the interior, particularly for goods like ivory, copper, and, yes, slaves. Though Nzinga's relationship with the slave trade was complex and shifted over time, sometimes participating in it to acquire firearms and other resources, at other times fiercely resisting Portuguese slave raiding of her own people. She encouraged agriculture to feed her population and her army, and she skillfully managed trade relations with those African groups and even some renegade Portuguese traders Pomberos who were willing to deal with her. She knew that wars weren't won on bravery alone. They needed resources, supplies, and a functioning economic base. An army marches on its stomach, as the saying goes, and Nzinga's army, it seems, was relatively well fed, at least by the standards of the time and place. Her quartermaster probably had fewer headaches than her Portuguese counterparts trying to supply their expeditions deep inland. One of the most fascinating and debated aspects of Nzinga's rule in Matamba is her alleged adoption of certain masculine roles and titles. As mentioned, some sources claim she dressed as a man in battle, maintained a harem of male consorts whom she called her wives, and insisted on being referred to as king. A quirky, though highly symbolic, tidbit often cited is that she supposedly declared that she was the king, and any man who disputed it would have to prove his manhood against her in a way that, well, let's just say it was a challenge no one was likely to take up. While these accounts likely contain elements of European exoticization and attempts to portray her as unnatural or barbaric, they also point to Nzinga's deliberate and skillful manipulation of gender norms to consolidate her authority in a predominantly patriarchal and militaristic society, especially one that now included the hyper-masculine Imbangala. By adopting male titles and attributes, she may have been asserting her supreme, unquestionable power, transcending traditional gender limitations on leadership. Historians still grapple with the interpretation of these gender-bending accounts. Were they literal truth, symbolic performances of power, or largely the product of biased European observers projecting their own anxieties and cultural misunderstandings onto a powerful African queen who defied their expectations? It's a complex question, but it highlights Nzinga's willingness to use any tool at her disposal, cultural, symbolic, or military, to secure her rule and command loyalty. Under Nzinga, Matamba became more than just a place of refuge. It became a beacon of resistance, attracting disaffected groups from Dongo and other regions oppressed by the Portuguese. It became a multi-ethnic, militarized state, forged in the crucible of war, and held together by the indomitable will and political acumen of its warrior queen. She had not just found a new home, she had built a new fortress, a formidable kingdom from which she would continue to defy one of Europe's major colonial powers for decades to come. The transformation of Matamba under her rule was a testament to her extraordinary leadership, her strategic vision, and her unwavering commitment to sovereignty. Nzinga is now firmly ensconced as the warrior monarch of Matamba, her new kingdom bristling with military energy and a defiant spirit. But even with her own growing forces, she knows that to effectively challenge the Portuguese and reclaim her ancestral lands in Dongo, she needs powerful allies. and in the complex, often brutal, political landscape of 17th century Angola, allies were not always found in the most conventional or comfortable places. This leads us to one of the most pragmatic, controversial, and ultimately effective strategic partnerships of Nzinga's career, her alliance with the Imbangala. The Imbangala, or Jaga as they were sometimes called by the Portuguese, were a collection of highly mobile militaristic warrior bands that had emerged in Central Africa in the preceding decades. They were a disruptive force, operating outside the traditional kinship structures and agricultural economies of the established Mbundu kingdoms. Their society was organized around a strict military code, with a strong emphasis on martial prowess, ritualistic practices designed to instill fearlessness, and a lifestyle based on raiding and warfare rather than settled farming. A key historical fact about the Mbangala is their notorious Quilombo, a fortified war camp governed by complex laws, which included a ban on raising children born within the camp. New recruits were often captured adolescents from other groups, forcibly assimilated. This, along with lurid and probably exaggerated Portuguese accounts of their supposed ritual cannibalism and infanticide, contributed to their fearsome reputation. They were, in essence, the ultimate mercenary shock troops of their day, highly effective, utterly ruthless, and loyal primarily to their own commanders and their warrior ethos. Not exactly the kind of folks you'd invite over for a quiet cup of tea and a chat about crop rotation. Nzinga, a shrewd political realist, saw in the Mbangala not just a band of terrifying marauders, but a potential military asset of immense value. They were skilled fighters, unencumbered by territorial loyalties beyond their immediate group. And they shared a common enemy with her, the Portuguese, who sometimes employed rival Mbangala factions but were also often a target of their raids. Sometime in the late 1620s or early 1630s, after establishing herself in Matamba, Nzinga forged a formal alliance with a prominent Mbangala group led by a war chief often referred to as Kasanje, though the identity and specific group can be a bit murky in the historical sources. This wasn't just a temporary hiring of mercenaries, it seems to have been a deeper, more integrated partnership. To seal this alliance and gain the full loyalty of these formidable warriors, Nzinga reportedly took the extraordinary step of undergoing some of their initiation rites and adopting certain Mbangala customs and titles. As we touched upon, this is where the stories of her dressing as a man, taking male wives, and even participating in some of their more brutal rituals come into play. While the most extreme of these claims, like cannibalism, are highly suspect and likely products of Portuguese propaganda aimed at dehumanizing both Nzinga and the Mbangala, it is plausible that she did adopt certain martial affectations or titles to command the respect of these hyper-masculine warrior groups. She needed to be seen not just as an allied queen, but as a fellow war leader, someone who understood and embodied their fierce, uncompromising spirit. It was a masterful piece of political theater and cultural adaptation, if also a morally ambiguous one. Imagine a highly educated, aristocratic CEO deciding to join a biker gang to secure a business deal. It's a bold move, requiring a certain suspension of one's usual operating procedures. Right, Nzinga might have thought. If it means an extra 10,000 battle-hardened warriors, I can learn to appreciate the strategic value of a good ritualistic war dance. Just past the ceremonial face paint, this alliance with the Mbangala significantly bolstered Nzinga's military capabilities. Their battlefield ferocity, their discipline, and their unconventional tactics made them a potent force against both Portuguese colonial troops and rival African armies. With Mbangala warriors integrated into her forces, Nzinga was able to launch more aggressive campaigns, to raid Portuguese-controlled territories more effectively, and to project her power over a wider area. It was a pragmatic, if ruthless, decision. The Mbangala were a double-edged sword, incredibly effective allies, but also a force that, if not carefully managed, could be destabilizing. A quirky tidbit that speaks to the strangeness of these alliances is that the Portuguese themselves frequently made use of Mbangala mercenaries in their own campaigns. So, you had this bizarre situation where different Imbangala factions might be fighting on opposite sides of a conflict, sometimes allied with Nzinga, sometimes with the Portuguese. Depending on the shifting political winds and who was offering the better deal, it was a complex, multi-sided chess game, and the Imbangala were powerful and unpredictable pieces on the board. Historians continue to debate the long-term consequences and ethical implications of Nzinga's Imbangala alliance. Did her adoption of some of their practices fundamentally alter her own character or the nature of her rule? Did it alienate some of her more traditional Mbundu followers? And how much control did she really have over her Imbangala allies? Versus how much was it a partnership of mutual convenience that could unravel if their interests diverged? These are complex questions without easy answers. What is clear is that, for a crucial period, this unlikely and often unsettling pact provided Nzinga with the military muscle she desperately needed to survive, to expand her power in Matamba, and to continue her decades-long resistance against a far more powerful European foe. It was a testament to her political realism, her willingness to make hard choices, and her adaptability in the face of overwhelming odds. She wasn't afraid to dance with wolves, if it meant protecting her flock. Nzinga, now the formidable warrior queen of a strengthened Matamba, her armies bolstered by the fierce Imbangala, continues her relentless struggle against the Portuguese. But she's a canny enough strategist to know that military might alone might not be enough to secure her long-term goals of sovereignty and the recovery of Ndongo. She needs to play the diplomatic game as well, and that means looking for cracks in the European colonial edifice, for potential allies who share her enmity towards the Portuguese. And in the mid-17th century, a new European power sails onto the Angolan coast, presenting Nzinga with just such an opportunity. This is where Nzinga's chessboard expands, and she prepares to play a new European card with her characteristic cunning. The Dutch Republic, in the 17th century, was a rising maritime and commercial power, aggressively challenging the global empires of Spain and Portugal. The Dutch West India Company, in particular, was keen to muscle in on the lucrative trade routes and colonial possessions of its Iberian rivals, including those in Africa and the Americas. A key historical fact is that in 1641, a Dutch fleet successfully captured the Portuguese stronghold of Luanda, the very administrative and commercial heart of Angola. This was a massive blow to Portuguese power in the region and created a sudden, dramatic shift in the geopolitical landscape. For Nzinga, watching from her inland kingdom of Matamba, the arrival of the Dutch must have seemed like a godsend, or at least a very interesting new variable in the equation. The enemy of her enemy, as the old saying goes, could very well be her friend, or at least a useful temporary partner. Well, she might have mused. It seems my Portuguese friends have some new European competition. This could be advantageous. Nzinga, ever the astute diplomat, didn't waste much time in reaching out to the new Dutch authorities in Luanda. She saw an opportunity to forge an alliance that could tip the scales decisively against the Portuguese. The Dutch, for their part, were also looking for local allies to help them consolidate their hold on Angola and disrupt Portuguese control over the slave trade, which they, too, were keen to profit from. It must be said, European powers rarely had purely altruistic motives. Nzinga, with her established military power in Matamba and her ongoing war against the Portuguese, was an obvious candidate for such an alliance. Negotiations ensued, and by 1641, or shortly thereafter, Nzinga and the Dutch had entered into a formal military and commercial alliance. This was a hugely significant development. Nzinga now had access to a new source of European firearms, gunpowder, and other trade goods, which further strengthened her armies. The Dutch, in return, gained a powerful local ally who could harass the Portuguese inland, disrupt their supply lines, and potentially provide them with access to trade networks, including slaves, that bypassed Portuguese control. It was a partnership of mutual convenience, a classic example of realpolitik in a complex colonial setting. She was probably quite happy to trade her somewhat strained goddaughter relationship with the Portuguese governor for a more businesslike, comrade-in-arms relationship with the Dutch admiral. So you dislike the Portuguese as much as I do, and you have muskets to spare. Excellent. Let's talk terms. With Dutch support, Nzinga intensified her campaigns against the Portuguese and their remaining strongholds in Angola. Her forces, now better armed and working in concert with Dutch military objectives, were able to inflict significant defeats on the Portuguese. For a period in the 1640s, it seemed as though Portuguese power in Angola might be completely broken, with Nzinga and her Dutch allies poised to dominate the region. She even managed to reoccupy parts of her ancestral kingdom of Nongo for a time. A quirky tidbit from this period is the image of Nzinga's warriors, perhaps some of her Imbangala cohorts alongside her Matamba troops, fighting alongside Dutch soldiers. It must have been a striking and, for the Portuguese, deeply alarming sight. A potent fusion of African military prowess and European firepower, all directed against them. The cultural exchange, or perhaps just the pragmatic battlefield cooperation between these disparate groups would make for a fascinating study in itself. However, this Dutch alliance, like all alliances in this volatile region, was not without its complexities and limitations. The Dutch were primarily interested in their own commercial and strategic goals. Their commitment to Nzinga's long-term sovereignty was likely secondary. Furthermore, the Dutch hold on Luanda proved to be less secure than initially anticipated. The Portuguese, though weakened, were not entirely defeated and were determined to reclaim their prized Angolan colony. They still controlled other parts of the coast and had significant support from their Brazilian territories. Historians often debate the true depth and impact of the Nzinga-Dutch alliance. Was it a genuine game-changer that almost succeeded in ousting the Portuguese permanently? Or was it more of a temporary fillip to Nzinga's ongoing resistance? Ultimately limited by the Dutch inability or unwillingness to commit sufficient resources to hold Angola in the long run, it certainly provided Nzinga with a crucial window of opportunity, allowing her to significantly strengthen her position and deal heavy blows to her primary adversary. But the winds of international fortune are notoriously fickle. In 1648, a powerful Portuguese expeditionary force, sent from Brazil under the command of Salvador Correia de Sá e Benavides, successfully recaptured Luanda from the Dutch. This marked the end of the formal Dutch presence in Angola and, consequently, the end of Nzinga's direct alliance with them. She was once again facing the resurgent Portuguese largely on her own, though the experience and resources gained during the Dutch period would continue to serve her well. The new European card had been played, and while it had brought temporary advantages, the long, grueling game for Angolan sovereignty was far from over. Nzinga, as always, would adapt and fight on. The Dutch have sailed away from Luanda. Their brief interlude as a major power in Angola over. The Portuguese, reinstalled and re-energized, are once again Nzinga's primary European adversary. You might think that after decades of relentless conflict, losing and gaining territories, forging and breaking alliances, that Queen Nzinga, now well into her 60s and advanced age for the 17th century, especially for a warrior constantly on campaign, might be ready to seek a lasting peace. Perhaps even accept some form of nominal Portuguese suzerainty in exchange for security. But if you thought that, you'd be underestimating the indomitable spirit of Matamba's guerrilla queen. For Nzinga, the departure of the Dutch didn't mean surrender. It meant adapting her strategies and continuing the resistance by any means necessary, embarking on decades more of relentless, savvy, and often brutal guerrilla warfare. With the Dutch alliance gone, Nzinga could no longer count on a steady supply of European firearms or the direct military support of a European power. She had to rely more heavily on her own Matamba forces, her Imbangala allies, though these alliances could be fluid, and her deep understanding of the local terrain and the psychology of her enemies. She knew she couldn't defeat the Portuguese in conventional set-piece battles where their superior firepower would usually prevail. So, she intensified her use of tactics that had always been part of her repertoire hit-and-run raids: ambushes in dense forests or narrow mountain passes, disruption of Portuguese supply lines and slave raiding expeditions, and the strategic use of fortified settlements quilombos deep in the interior, which were difficult for Portuguese columns to reach and assault. She became a master of asymmetrical warfare, making the cost of Portuguese occupation and expansion incredibly high. It was like trying to swat a swarm of very angry, very well-organized hornets. You might get a few, but you're going to get stung, repeatedly and painfully. A key historical fact about Nzinga's long resistance is its sheer duration. From her ascent to power in the 1620s until her death in 1663, she was almost constantly engaged in some form of military or diplomatic struggle against the Portuguese. This wasn't a brief rebellion, it was a multi-generational war of attrition, led by a queen who simply refused to be conquered. She became a living legend, a symbol of defiance for her own people and a source of immense frustration and grudging respect for her Portuguese adversaries. They called her Nzinga, often with a mixture of fear and exasperation. They just couldn't seem to pin her down or break her will. She was the ultimate survivor, the queen who always found a way to slip through their grasp and fight another day. "Confound that woman," a Portuguese commander might exclaim, after another of his patrols was ambushed. "She's like a shadow with a spear, and she stole all our good cooking pots again." Nzinga's guerrilla tactics were not just about random raids. They were part of a broader strategy to make Portuguese control outside of their coastal strongholds untenable. She aimed to disrupt their trade, particularly the slave trade, which was the economic lifeblood of their colony. She would offer refuge to escaped slaves and disaffected groups, swelling her own ranks and undermining the Portuguese labor supply. She would attack Pombero caravans, seize their goods, and free their captives. She turned the interior into a hostile environment for the Portuguese, a place where they could never feel entirely secure. Her leadership during these campaigns was reportedly direct and inspiring. Even in her later years, she was said to accompany her troops, strategizing, encouraging, and perhaps even participating in some of the fighting, though the image of an elderly queen personally leading charges is likely an embellishment. However, her presence, her reputation, and her unwavering determination were undoubtedly powerful motivators for her warriors. She wasn't just a distant ruler sending others to die. She was a queen who had shared their hardships and understood the realities of war. A quirky, though brutal, aspect of this protracted guerrilla war was the psychological toll it took on both sides. For Nzinga's people, it meant decades of insecurity, displacement, and loss. For the Portuguese, it meant constant vigilance, the attrition of their forces, and the frustration of fighting an elusive enemy who knew the land intimately. There are accounts of Portuguese soldiers becoming demoralized, fearing Nzinga's name and the reputation of her warriors. She cultivated an aura of invincibility and ruthlessness that served her well as a psychological weapon. Historians continue to analyze the effectiveness and the human cost of Nzinga's long guerrilla war. Did her relentless resistance ultimately save her core kingdom of Matamba from complete subjugation, even if Ndongo remained largely under Portuguese influence? Or did it prolong the suffering of her people and lead to further devastation in the region? It's a complex calculation. What is clear is that Nzinga, through her decades of armed struggle, forced the Portuguese to recognize Matamba as a significant independent power, a state they could not easily ignore or conquer. She carved out a space for her people's survival in a world increasingly dominated by European colonial ambition. Even as she waged war, Nzinga never entirely abandoned diplomacy. She understood that her ultimate security might lie in a negotiated settlement, but she was determined to negotiate from a position of strength, not weakness. Her endless war was, in part, a means to that end, to make the cost of continued conflict so high for the Portuguese that they would eventually be willing to treat with her as an equal and respect her sovereignty. The guerrilla queen was not just a fighter, she was a long-term strategist, playing a very long game for the future of her people and her land. Decades have passed. Nzinga, the indomitable queen of Matamba, has spent the better part of her adult life locked in a relentless military struggle against the Portuguese. She's employed every strategy imaginable open battle in her early days in Ndongo. Strategic retreats, the forging of powerful if controversial alliances with the Mbangala, a shrewd partnership with the Dutch, and then long, grinding years of guerrilla warfare. But Nzinga is not just a warrior, she is, at her core, a master diplomat, a political realist who understands that even the most successful war must eventually give way to some form of negotiation if lasting stability is to be achieved. As she enters her later years, with the geopolitical sands of Angola constantly shifting, you see her once again engaging in the intricate dance of diplomacy, seeking a new equilibrium with her old adversaries. The departure of the Dutch in 1648 had, as we saw, left Nzinga in a more isolated position militarily, facing a resurgent Portuguese presence. While her guerrilla campaigns continued to make life difficult for the colonial power, she likely recognized that a complete military victory, the total expulsion of the Portuguese from Angola, was improbable given their resources and global reach. Moreover, constant warfare, even if successful in preserving Matamba's independence, took a terrible toll on her own people and her kingdom's resources. There was a limit to how long such a state of perpetual conflict could be sustained. Perhaps she also sensed that her own time was not infinite, and she needed to secure a more stable future for Matamba beyond her own lifetime. It's the kind of long-term thinking that separates a mere warlord from a true stateswoman. Right, she might have mused, looking out over her war-weary but still defiant kingdom. We've shown them we can't be broken. Perhaps now it's time to show them we can also be reasonably negotiated with, on my terms, of course. Sometime in the 1650s, Nzinga began to make new overtures towards the Portuguese. This wasn't a sign of weakness, but rather a strategic pivot. She had spent years demonstrating her military strength and her kingdom's resilience. Now, she could approach the negotiating table not as a defeated supplicant as she had been perceived, wrongly, in her first embassy to Luanda decades earlier, but as the ruler of a significant independent power that the Portuguese simply couldn't ignore or easily crush. A key historical fact is that in 1656, after a long series of on-again, off-again negotiations and skirmishes, Nzinga concluded a peace treaty with the Portuguese. This treaty formally recognized her as the legitimate ruler of Matamba and acknowledged its independence, though it also involved certain concessions and agreements regarding trade and, significantly, her renewed and more formal re-embrace of Christianity. This return to a more public Christian identity was a crucial part of her later diplomatic strategy. She had been baptized as Dona Ana de Sousa way back in 1622, but during her long wars and her alliance with the non-Christian Mbangala, her adherence to the faith had been, to put it mildly, somewhat flexible. Now, in her later years, she actively sought to re-establish ties with the Catholic Church, welcoming Capuchin missionaries into Matamba, building churches, and promoting Christian practices among her people. This was, again, likely a complex blend of personal conviction, perhaps a genuine return to the faith in her old age and astute political calculation. By presenting Matamba as a Christian kingdom, she made it more difficult for the Portuguese to justify continued aggression on religious grounds. It also facilitated diplomatic and commercial relations with the Portuguese and potentially with Rome itself. She was, in effect, seeking international legitimacy and a more stable place for Matamba within the emerging colonial world order. She even wrote letters to the Pope, a remarkable act for an African queen of her time. A quirky and rather charming tidbit from this period is that Nzinga, in her efforts to demonstrate her renewed Christian piety, reportedly insisted that her court adopt European-style dress and manners when receiving Portuguese envoys or missionaries. Imagine her formidable warriors, perhaps some of her old Imbangola comrades, reluctantly struggling into ruffled shirts and breeches for a diplomatic reception. For the queen, and for this rather itchy lace collar, I suppose, it was all part of the performance of diplomacy, a way of meeting the Europeans on terms they understood and respected, while still retaining her own undiminished authority. The negotiations leading up to the 1656 treaty, and indeed the relationship with the Portuguese thereafter, were never entirely smooth. There were still periods of tension, mistrust, and minor conflict. Nzinga had to constantly navigate the shifting policies of different Portuguese governors, the demands of missionary orders, and the internal politics of her own kingdom, where some factions might have been wary of her renewed engagement with their old enemy. Historians continue to analyze the motivations and consequences of Nzinga's later diplomatic overtures. Was she genuinely seeking a lasting peace? Or was it simply another phase in her long game? A way to buy time, rebuild her strength, and secure her dynasty? Did her re-embrace of Christianity represent a true spiritual shift? Or was it primarily a tool of statecraft? As always with Nzinga, the answers are likely nuanced. A blend of pragmatism, personal belief, and an unwavering commitment to the survival and sovereignty of her people. What is clear is that in her final decades, she demonstrated that her diplomatic skills were as sharp as ever. She had fought the Portuguese to a standstill for much of her life, and now she was using diplomacy to carve out a recognized independent space for her kingdom. A remarkable achievement for an African ruler in the face of relentless European colonial expansion. The warrior queen was also, to the very end, a master of the diplomatic dance. As we delve deeper into the long and multifaceted reign of Queen Nzinga, you begin to appreciate that she was far more than just a brilliant military strategist or a cunning diplomat. Her rule was a complex tapestry woven with threads of political pragmatism, deep-seated cultural understanding, a shifting religious identity, and a remarkable ability to challenge and manipulate the gender norms of her time. To truly understand Nzinga, you have to look beyond the battlefield victories and the treaty negotiations into the very heart of her complex, and sometimes contradictory, approach to power and leadership. She wasn't just surviving, she was actively crafting a unique and potent form of queenship in a world designed to limit her. Let's first consider her religious journey. Baptized Dona Ana de Sousa in 1622 in a highly strategic move. Nzinga's adherence to Christianity seemed to wax and wane depending on the political climate and her alliances. During her alliance with the fiercely non-Christian Mbangala warriors, she reportedly adopted many of their traditional religious practices and titles, seemingly abandoning her Christian identity to solidify her leadership over these crucial military allies. This has led some to view her early conversion as purely cynical. However, in her later years, particularly after the 1656 peace treaty with the Portuguese, she made a very public and sustained re-embrace of Catholicism. She invited Capuchin missionaries to Matamba, corresponded with the Pope, encouraged baptism among her people, and sought to establish Matamba as a recognized Christian kingdom. A historical fact is that these later missionary accounts, while still written from a European and Christian perspective, provide some of our most detailed, if sometimes biased, insights into Nzinga's court and her later rule. So, what was the nature of Nzinga's faith? Was she a lifelong secret believer who had to hide her Christianity during times of political necessity? Was she a pragmatist who adopted whatever religious trappings best served her strategic interests at any given moment? Or did she perhaps find a way to synthesize elements of Mbundu traditional beliefs with Christianity, creating a syncretic faith that resonated with her own spiritual and political needs? Historians still debate these questions intensely. It's quite possible that Nzinga's understanding and practice of Christianity were different from that of her European missionary confessors, imbued with her own cultural interpretations and focused on its utility in securing her kingdom's spiritual and temporal well-being. She was, after all, a queen first and foremost, and her primary responsibility was to her people. If embracing Christianity helped protect them, then it was a path worth taking. Regardless of the theological nuances that might have preoccupied European minds, she was essentially the ultimate pragmatist, perhaps thinking, if a few Hail Marys keep the Portuguese cannons quiet and my trade routes open, then pass the holy water and let's get to praying. Strategically, then there's the fascinating issue of Nzinga and gender. In a world where political and military leadership was overwhelmingly male, Nzinga not only ruled as a queen, but also as a supreme war commander for decades. We've touched on the accounts of her adopting male dress, titles like king, and even maintaining a harem of male consorts, whom she reportedly dressed as women and referred to as her wives. Nay, quirky, though again heavily debated and possibly sensationalized, tidbit is that she supposedly made these male consorts compete, sometimes to the death, for the privilege of spending a single night with her, after which the winner would be executed. While such extreme claims are likely European fabrications designed to paint her as unnatural and barbaric, the underlying theme of Nzinga deliberately subverting and manipulating gender roles to assert her authority is compelling. By presenting herself as a female king, by embodying both masculine martial prowess and feminine royal legitimacy, she may have been creating a unique leadership persona that transcended traditional categories and allowed her to command loyalty from diverse groups, including the hypermasculine Mbangala. She refused to be confined by European or even some traditional Mundu expectations of female behavior. She was a ruler, a warrior, a diplomat, and she would use whatever symbols and strategies were necessary to maintain her power and protect her people. It was a masterclass in personal branding and power politics, centuries ahead of its time. You expect a meek queen in a pretty dress? Her actions seem to say, "Think again. I am the storm, and I decide how I will be addressed." Her relationship with her sisters, particularly Kifunji, often referred to by the Portuguese as Dona Barbara and Mukambu Dona Gracia, also adds complexity to her story. While they sometimes acted as her envoys or supported her rule, there were also periods of rivalry, betrayal, and manipulation, often exacerbated by Portuguese interference as they tried to play different members of the royal family against each other. Nzinga's ability to navigate these treacherous family dynamics, alongside her external struggles, further highlights her political astuteness. Nzinga's long reign, therefore, cannot be understood through a single lens. She was a devout Christian at times, a practitioner of traditional rituals at others, a queen, a king, a ruthless military leader, a patient diplomat, a sister, an aunt. She was a product of her turbulent times, a leader who had to be all things to all people, and often a dangerous adversary to many. Her complexities are what make her so endlessly fascinating, a ruler who defied easy categorization and who used every facet of her identity and every tool at her disposal in her lifelong quest for sovereignty and survival. The decades of relentless warfare, intricate diplomacy, and constant vigilance have taken their toll. But Queen Nzinga, now an elderly woman by 17th century standards, likely in her late 70s or even early 80s, remains a formidable presence on the Angolan stage. Her primary focus in these final years, following the 1656 peace treaty with the Portuguese, shifts from active military confrontation to the equally challenging tasks of consolidating the peace. Rebuilding her kingdoms of Ndongo and Matamba, though her effective control was now centered on Matamba, and, crucially, trying to secure a stable succession that would preserve her hard-won legacy after she was gone. You're witnessing a seasoned stateswoman trying to ensure her life's work wasn't all for naught, a final act in a long and dramatic play. The peace treaty with Portugal, while a landmark achievement, was not a magic wand that instantly erased decades of conflict and mistrust. Nzinga had to work diligently to maintain it. This involved ongoing diplomatic engagement with the Portuguese governors in Luanda, careful management of trade relations which still often involve the contentious issue of slaves, though Nzinga increasingly tried to regulate or limit Portuguese slave raiding within her direct territories, and continued adherence to her public Christian identity. She understood that any perceived weakness or wavering on her part could invite renewed Portuguese aggression. It was a delicate balancing act, requiring a constant attention and shrewd judgment. She couldn't just put her feet up and enjoy her golden years with a nice cup of palm wine. The wolves were always, metaphorically speaking, just beyond the firelight. A significant part of her efforts in these later years was dedicated to strengthening the internal structures of Matamba. She focused on promoting agriculture to ensure food security, encouraging trade to rebuild the kingdom's wealth, and integrating the diverse groups within her realm, her Ndongo followers, the original Matamba inhabitants, and remnants of her Imbangala allies, though the formal Imbangala alliance had largely dissolved by this point, with many Imbangala groups becoming more settled or forming their own polities. She also continued to promote Christianity, with the help of the Capuchin missionaries she had invited into her kingdom. A key historical fact from this period is Nzinga's extensive correspondence with these missionaries and even with the Pope in Rome, seeking religious guidance, requesting more priests, and affirming her commitment to the faith. These letters, some of which survive, offer a fascinating glimpse into her mindset and her diplomatic efforts to position Matamba as a legitimate Christian kingdom in the eyes of Europe. She was essentially lobbying the Vatican, a rather bold move for an African queen of her era. "Your Holiness," she might have dictated, "about those extra capuchins I requested, and perhaps a small papal blessing for our upcoming yam harvest." Every little bit helps when you're surrounded by Portuguese governors with itchy trigger fingers. But perhaps Nzinga's greatest concern in her final years was the question of succession. She had no surviving children of her own. Any children she may have had likely died young or were casualties of the long wars. This was a major vulnerability in a system where dynastic continuity was crucial for stability. She needed to designate an heir who could command loyalty, maintain the kingdom's independence, and ideally continue her complex relationship with the Portuguese and the Church. Her choice eventually fell upon her sister, Kifunji, who was also known by her Christian name, Dona Barbara. Nzinga spent considerable effort grooming Dona Barbara for leadership, involving her in state affairs and ensuring she had the support of key military commanders and political figures. This was no easy task, as there were undoubtedly other potential claimants or factions who might have sought to seize power after Nzinga's death. A quirky and rather poignant tidbit is that Nzinga, in her very old age, reportedly became increasingly devout, spending much time in prayer and religious observance. Some accounts suggest she even expressed remorse for some of the more brutal actions of her earlier warrior years, particularly those associated with her Imbangala alliance. Whether this was a genuine late-life spiritual reckoning, a calculated move to further solidify her Christian credentials and secure a peaceful succession, or perhaps a mixture of both, is something historians ponder. It adds another layer to her complex and evolving persona. Nzinga Mbande, Queen of Ndongo and Matamba. Dona Ana de Sousa died in her capital in Matamba on December 17, 1663, at a very advanced age for her time. She had ruled for nearly 4 decades, a period marked by almost continuous struggle, extraordinary resilience, and brilliant statecraft. She had faced down one of Europe's major colonial powers, adapted to shifting alliances, manipulated religious and gender norms, and ultimately carved out a space for her people's survival and sovereignty. Her final years were dedicated to trying to ensure that this legacy would endure. The scholarly debate often continues around the long-term success of her succession plans. While her sister Dona Barbara did succeed her, the internal stability of Matamba and its relationship with Ndongo and the Portuguese remained complex and often fraught in the years that followed. However, Nzinga had undeniably left an indelible mark. She had transformed Matamba into a significant regional power and had, through her sheer force of will and political acumen, created a tradition of resistance that would inspire future generations. Her final diplomatic maneuvers and her careful attention to the future of her kingdom were the last acts of a truly remarkable ruler, a queen who fought not just for power, but for the very existence of her people in a rapidly and dangerously changing world. Queen Nzinga Mbande is laid to rest in Matamba, her long, tumultuous, and extraordinary reign finally over. The year is 1663. For nearly 80 years, she had been a witness to and a primary actor in the dramatic collision of African kingdoms and European colonial ambition in West Central Africa. As the dust settles on her remarkable life, you're left to ponder her legacy, a legacy that is complex, contested, but undeniably potent, echoing down through the centuries, not just in Angola, but across the African diaspora and in the annals of resistance against oppression. She wasn't just a queen, she became an icon. The immediate aftermath of Nzinga's death, as is often the case after the passing of such a dominant and long-reigning leader, was a period of uncertainty and some instability. Her sister, Dona Barbara Kifunji, succeeded her as planned, but maintaining the unity and strength of Matamba and navigating the ongoing pressures from the Portuguese and neighboring African states proved to be a continuing challenge. The peace treaty Nzinga had so carefully negotiated with the Portuguese in 1656 provided a framework, but it was a fragile one, constantly tested by the realities of colonial expansion and the lucrative, brutal slave trade that continued to ravage the region. However, the very fact that Matamba continued to exist as a recognized, largely independent kingdom for many decades after Nzinga's death is a testament to the strong foundations she had laid. She had created a state with a resilient military tradition and a strong sense of identity, capable of weathering future storms. It wasn't quite the happily ever after of a fairy tale, but in the harsh world of 17th century colonial Africa, it was a significant achievement. Nzinga's most enduring legacy, perhaps, is her powerful symbolism as a figure of anti-colonial resistance. In a historical narrative often dominated by European conquerors and African victims, Nzinga stands out as a potent example of successful, long-term African agency and defiance. For decades, she outmaneuvered, outfought, and outnegotiated one of Europe's leading colonial powers, using her intellect, her courage, and her profound understanding of both African and European political cultures. This has made her a celebrated figure in Angolan national identity, where she is revered as a founding mother, a symbol of freedom and resistance against foreign domination. A key historical fact is that her image has appeared on Angolan currency, and streets and public places are named in her honor. She is not a forgotten footnote. She is a central character in the nation's story. If you visit Luanda today, you can even find a massive statue of her, a powerful modern tribute to this 17th century warrior queen. Her story also resonates far beyond Angola. Nzinga has become an icon for people of African descent worldwide, a symbol of Black female empowerment, resilience in the face of oppression, and brilliant leadership against overwhelming odds. Her ability to navigate complex gender roles, to command armies, and to engage with European powers on her own terms has made her a compelling figure for feminist historians and those seeking to recover and celebrate the stories of powerful women in history, particularly women of color, whose narratives have often been marginalized or ignored. She wasn't just a queen fighting for her kingdom. She was a woman challenging the patriarchal norms of her own society and the racist assumptions of her European adversaries. You go, girl. 17th century style. A quirky, though perhaps more academic, aspect of her legacy is the sheer volume of historical documentation she generated, or that was generated about her. Because of her long and prominent engagement with the Portuguese and, to a lesser extent, the Dutch and the Vatican, Nzinga is one of the best documented pre-colonial African rulers. We have letters she wrote or dictated, missionary accounts, Portuguese colonial records, and diplomatic correspondence, all of which provide rich, if often biased and contradictory, source material for understanding her life and times. This wealth of documentation has allowed historians to reconstruct her story with a level of detail that is rare for many other figures from that era. Of course, this also means that her image has been constantly reinterpreted and contested, shaped by the perspectives and agendas of those who wrote about her, both then and now. Historians continue to debate various aspects of Nzinga's reign, the true nature of her religious conversions, the ethics of her alliance with the Imbangala, the extent to which she was a nationalist leader in the modern sense versus a pragmatic dynastic ruler. Was she a ruthless opportunist who used any means necessary to gain and maintain power? Or a principled freedom fighter dedicated to her people's liberation? The answer, as with most complex historical figures, is likely somewhere in between, a rich tapestry of ambition, necessity, courage, and strategic brilliance. What remains undeniable is Nzinga Mbande's extraordinary impact. For over 4 decades, she stood as a bulwark against colonial conquest, a symbol of African sovereignty in an age of increasing European domination. She was a warrior, a diplomat, a state builder, and a survivor. Her legacy is not just one of military resistance, but also of profound political intelligence, cultural adaptability, and an indomitable will to remain free. The echo of Nzinga's reign, her cunning, her courage, and her complexity, continues to inspire and instruct, a timeless story of a queen who dared to defy an empire and, in doing so, carved her name indelibly into the heart of Angolan, African, and world history. And so, the remarkable story of Queen Nzinga Mbande, the Angolan ruler whose cunning diplomacy and fierce resistance echoed through the courts and battlefields of 17th century Africa, draws to its close. Her life, a tapestry woven with threads of war and negotiation, faith and pragmatism, exile and triumph, serves as a powerful testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of overwhelming adversity. As the image of this warrior queen, perhaps seated on her human chair defying a governor, or leading her troops into battle, or meticulously dictating a letter to the Pope, begins to fade from your mind, let the profound sense of her strength and intellect settle gently. The turbulent world she navigated has long since passed, its immediate conflicts resolved into the broader currents of history. Yet the echo of her indomitable will, her refusal to be subjugated, continues to resonate. May you find in her story a quiet inspiration, a reminder of the enduring power of courage and a well-played hand, even against the steepest odds. And now, as the night deepens, may your own thoughts find peace, and your rest be as profound and untroubled as the ancient Angolan plains under a canopy of stars. And end of script. Sweet dreams.